Margot knew, from the very first moment she saw him, that Arthur Whitmore carried two things unusually common in Monaco: a fortune and a family drama he had not yet decided how to survive. He came in on a Tuesday, which was already suspicious. Tourists came on weekends, drawn by the shimmer of the port and the casino's promises. Men with money and no particular purpose came on Tuesdays. He stood at the threshold of Parfumerie Céleste for a moment, looking in, and something in his stillness made Margot set down the bottle she was polishing. He was tall, English in the way that needed no explanation, the jaw, the posture, the coat that was expensive but worn as though expense embarrassed him. Late 20s, perhaps 30. His eyes moved across the shelves slowly, and Margot recognized something in that careful attention. She had seen it on her father's face when he walked through vineyards. Not pleasure exactly, but a man trying to locate himself in a place that had nothing to do with his troubles. "Bonjour," she said from behind the counter. He looked at her as though he had not expected anyone to be there. Then, slowly, he smiled. And Margot had the distinct feeling that trouble had just walked in and chosen her favorite shelf to lean against. "Welcome, my dear friend. My name is Marina, and I have always believed that the most beautiful things in life have a history behind them. I am passionate about art, about the stories that cities carry in their stones and their light. Some time ago, Monaco found me, or perhaps I found it. I am not entirely sure which. But from the moment I discovered the history of this small, luminous principality, something in me did not want to let go. So I began to write. Short stories, intimate ones, set in the Monaco of another era. When the port smelled of salt and ambition, when women wore silk in the afternoon, and when a chance encounter could change the course of a life. I write them with love, and with a deep respect for the feeling of that world. And because I also live with a great passion for painting and visual art, I use artificial intelligence to bring these stories to life through images, illustrations inspired by the art styles I have always admired. Impressionism, classic portraiture, the warm light of mid-century European painting. This is my little corner of nostalgia. I hope it feels to you like a place worth visiting. If Monaco has found a place in your heart too, I would love to know. Tell me in the comments. In today's story, we follow Margot, 22 years old, sharp-eyed, and quietly restless behind the counter of a small perfume shop in the heart of Monte Carlo. And we follow Arthur Whitmore, heir to one of the great coal dynasties of northern England, a family that had built its fortune on the backs of men who spent their lives underground, in the dark. It is 1962. In Britain, the coal industry is collapsing in slow motion. Hundreds of mines are shutting down, and the men who worked them are being pushed out with nothing. Arthur's father belongs to the old world, the world that sees this as simply the cost of progress. Arthur does not. After one argument too many, he boards a train south and keeps going until the sea stops him. He arrives in Monaco at a peculiar moment. Prince Rainier has just signed a new constitution, one that grants women the right to vote. The tiny principality is reinventing itself, reaching towards something more just, more modern. And France, under de Gaulle, is watching with suspicion, tightening its grip around its borders. Monaco is a place holding its breath. Into this charged and luminous world walks Arthur Whitmore, a man running from his inheritance. And behind the counter of Parfumerie Céleste, Margot is waiting, though she doesn't know it yet. Arthur looked at her as though he had not expected anyone to be there. Then, slowly, he smiled, and Margot had the distinct feeling that trouble had just walked in and chosen her favorite shelf to lean against. He browsed without urgency, picking up bottles and setting them down again, reading labels he almost certainly could not read. His French, when he finally attempted it, was careful and a little painful. "Je cherche," he began, then stopped. "I'm sorry. Do you speak English?" "A little," Margot said, which was not entirely true. She spoke it quite well. She was not sure, in that moment, why she chose to make herself smaller than she was. "I'm looking for something," he said. "For a woman." "Most men who come here are," she answered, before she could stop herself. He looked at her then, really looked for the first time. And something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more interior than that. "A gift," he said. "For my mother, her birthday." Margot nodded and came around the counter, because that was her job, and because she needed something to do with her hands. She led him toward the older fragrances, the ones with weight and history. She spoke about them the way she always did, with quiet authority, choosing words she thought might reach him. Jasmine from grass, a hint of bergamot, something that lasts. He listened. She was almost certain he listened. But his eyes moved occasionally to the window, to the street outside, to somewhere she could not follow. And she found herself wondering what it was that kept pulling him away from the present moment. From her. She handed him a small glass vial and watched him hold it to the light. "This one," she said. "It's warm, serious, but with something underneath, something that surprises you." He turned the vial slowly in his fingers. "How do you know what she'd like?" he asked. "You've never met her." "I don't," Margot said. "I know what the perfume is, what your mother is. That part is yours." He looked at her again. That same interior look, the one she couldn't quite name. Then he set the vial down on the glass counter between them, gently, as if it were something fragile and worth protecting. "I'll take it," he said. He paid without haggling, without the performance some men made of generosity. He took the small wrapped parcel and moved toward the door, and Margot watched him go the way she always watched the sea from her apartment window, with the vague, helpless feeling that something was moving away from her, and she had no right to call it back. He paused at the threshold. For one suspended moment, she thought he might turn around. He didn't. The little brass bell announced his departure with the same careless cheerfulness with which it had announced his arrival, and Margot stood in the silence he left behind, one hand resting on the glass counter, wondering whether she had imagined the whole thing, or only the part that mattered. He came back the following day. Margot was arranging a new display near the window when the bell above the door announced him. Amber flacons caught the morning light, and she had been pleased with how they looked until she turned and found him standing there and forgot entirely what she had been doing. She composed herself in the half-second she had available. "Bonjour, monsieur," she said, with the same warm, neutral smile she gave everyone. He returned it. "Bonjour." He looked around the shop with the same unhurried attention as before, hands in his pockets, as though he had all the time that money could buy, and no particular idea what to spend it on. Then he said, without quite meeting her eyes, "I thought I might find something. For myself this time." Margot had worked in the shop for 3 years. She knew the men who came in for themselves. They knew what they wanted, or they asked immediately, or they lingered with the specific restlessness of someone hoping to be impressed. Arthur Whitmore did none of these things. He moved along the shelves without touching anything, and she had the quiet, unsettling impression that the perfumes were not really the point. She let the silence sit for a moment, the way her mother had taught her to let dough rest, because to rush it was to ruin it. "What do you wear now?" she asked finally. He turned. "Sorry." "Your current fragrance. What is it?" He looked genuinely stumped, as though the question had arrived from a direction he hadn't anticipated. "I don't know. Something from a hotel bathroom, I think." She looked at him for a moment, straight and steady. "You're staying in a hotel?" "Yes." "In Monaco?" "Yes." "And you've been here, how long?" A pause. 10 days. She said nothing. 10 days in a hotel meant either that he had nowhere else to go, or that he was in no hurry to find somewhere. She suspected both were true, and she suspected he knew she suspected, because something in his expression tightened almost imperceptibly, then relaxed, as if he had decided not to mind. "Come here," she said, and moved toward the far end of the counter. She pulled out 3 bottles, not the obvious choices, not the ones she showed everyone, and set them in a row on the glass. She uncapped the first and held it toward him without a word. He leaned in slightly, and for one disorienting moment, she was aware of how close that brought his face to her hand. "Cedar," she said, "and smoke. Something northern." He straightened. Something moved behind his eyes. "Too close to home?" she asked. It came out softer than she intended. More knowing. She felt the blood rise slightly in her face and was grateful for the angle of the light. "Perhaps," he said after a moment. She uncapped the second. "This one is the opposite, all Mediterranean. Fig, white flowers, warm stone in the afternoon. Monaco in a bottle, more or less." He tried it, and she watched his face with the professional attention she gave every client, telling herself that was all it was. "And the third?" he asked. "The third is more complicated." She uncapped it slowly. "It starts as one thing and becomes another. You have to wear it for an hour before you really know what it is." He looked at her then, and she had the sensation, fleeting, probably invented, that they were no longer talking about perfume. "That one," he said. She wrapped it the way she wrapped everything, carefully, with tissue and a small ribbon. And she was very deliberate about keeping her movements unhurried, because her heart had picked up a pace she found embarrassing, and she was determined that nothing in her hands would betray it. He took the parcel. He thanked her. He moved toward the door with the same easy, unhurried step. And this time, he did turn around. "I don't know your name," he said. "Margot." He repeated it once, quietly, as though he were placing it somewhere he intended to find it again. Then he left, and the little brass bell rang, and Margot stood very still in the late morning light, and told herself, with all the conviction she could assemble, that it meant nothing at all. She almost believed it. "My friend, sorry to interrupt, but to keep the channel going, I need your help. If you enjoy nostalgic tales of romance and glamour, consider subscribing. There are many more stories waiting for you here." It was her lunch hour, and Margot had taken the long way down toward the port, as she sometimes did when the morning had been slow, and the stillness of the shop had settled too heavily on her shoulders. She walked without hurry, her coat over one arm, squinting slightly against the brightness that bounced off the white facades and the water below. She did not know that he had seen her first. Arthur had been sitting at a small table outside a café on the Rue Grimaldi. A coffee in front of him that had gone cold, a newspaper open to a page he had not read. He had been watching the street with the unfocused attention of a man who has nowhere to be, and has not yet decided whether that is a freedom or a punishment. And then Margot had appeared at the top of the street, coat over her arm, and something in him had made a quiet, involuntary decision before his mind had time to weigh in. He left money on the table and followed, at a distance he told himself was coincidental. She stopped at a low wall above the port and stood looking out at the water, and he stood 20 meters behind her for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, aware of the precise stupidity of his situation. He was a grown man, the son of one of the wealthiest families in the north of England, standing on a Monegasque street corner because a girl in a perfume shop had wrapped a parcel with a small ribbon, and he had not been able to stop thinking about it. He walked toward her. "Mademoiselle." She turned, and the surprise on her face was genuine. He saw that clearly, and it relieved him more than he expected. "Monsieur Whitmore," she said, recovering quickly. "You are lost?" "Completely," he said. A pause. The port glittered beneath them. A gull crossed the sky in a long, patient arc. "This is the port," she said, with careful neutrality. "You can find your way from here." "Yes," he said. He made no move to go. She turned back to the water, and after a moment he came to stand beside her at the wall, close enough to be companionable, far enough to be respectful. And they looked out at the boats together in a silence that was not entirely comfortable, and not entirely uncomfortable either. "It's a strange place," Arthur said, eventually. "Monaco. Beautiful, but—" He stopped. "But?" she asked. He shook his head slightly, as though reconsidering the sentence he had started. "Nothing. Only that it's easier to stay somewhere when you have somewhere else to go back to." Margot looked at him. He was still watching the boats, his jaw set in a way that suggested he had already said more than he intended. Below, a man was painting the hull of a small boat in unhurried strokes, and the silence that followed stretched long enough to become its own kind of conversation. "Forgive me," he said, after a moment. A brief, dry smile. "I don't usually—" He left that unfinished too, and straightened, and looked at his watch with the decisiveness of a man creating an exit. "You should get back to the shop." It wasn't a question. It was a retreat, and they both knew it. She said, of course, and they parted at the corner with a politeness that felt, to her, like a door left very slightly open. She walked back the way she had come. She did not look behind her. She wanted to. The afternoon had been quiet until the two women arrived. Margot heard them before she saw them, heels on the narrow street outside, and laughter of the particular kind that assumes the world is listening and doesn't mind. They came in together, bringing with them a cloud of expensive perfume that was already, in Margot's professional opinion, more than enough. The taller one led. She was perhaps 30, with the kind of beauty that had clearly been well maintained and was aware of the effort involved. Her friend followed, smaller, darker, speaking rapidly in French with an Italian accent, gesturing with her hands in a way that suggested the conversation had been going on for some time and showed no sign of resolution. "Kim, but you must wear something different, Isabel. You cannot arrive smelling exactly as you did at Cannes." "I'm not going to arrive smelling as I did at Cannes. That's precisely why we're here." They dissolved briefly into laughter, and Margot came forward with her professional smile, the one that was warm without being familiar. "Bonjour, mesdames. Can I help you?" Isabel, the tall one, turned and assessed the shop in a single sweeping glance that took in the shelves, the light, and Margot herself, in that order. "Something new," she said. "Something that makes an impression. I have a dinner tonight." "A very important dinner," the friend added with emphasis. "Any occasion I should keep in mind?" Margot asked. "The setting, the season." "The man," the friend said and laughed. Isabel silenced her with a look that was only partly disapproving. "There is an Englishman," Isabel said, with the careful casualness of someone who has rehearsed the sentence. "He'll be at the dinner tonight. One of those northern families. Coal, industry, the kind of money that smells of the last century. He's been here for some weeks, apparently alone. Nobody seems to know quite why." "There was some disagreement," the friend added, pulling off her gloves finger by finger. "With his family. Something about the mines, workers, conditions, the son refusing to stay quiet about it, which of course made everything worse." "I think it's rather admirable," Isabel said. "You think it's attractive?" her friend said, "which is different." Isabel ignored this. "Something warm," she told Margot. "Feminine, but not obvious. I want him to remember it." Margot selected 3 bottles and set them on the counter. She described each one with the same quiet competence she always brought to the work. The notes, the character, the way each one changed with the warmth of the skin. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. But something in her chest had gone very still. She watched Isabel lean over the counter to try the second fragrance, watched her long neck and her assured, unhurried elegance, and understood with a clarity that was almost physical the distance between this woman's world and her own. Isabel would sit across a candlelit table from someone tonight, someone who had been alone in Monaco for weeks, who had quarreled with his family over minors and conscience, and the kind of principles that cost something. She would speak his language in every sense. She would match his silences, occupy the same social atmosphere as naturally as breathing. Margot would close the shop at 7 and walk home up the hill. It was probably no one she knew. There were many Englishmen in Monaco, many northern families with coal money and complicated histories. It was almost certainly no one she knew. "This one," Isabel said, pointing to the second bottle. The warmest of the three. The one Margot would have chosen for her. She wrapped it carefully, as she wrapped everything. Tissue, ribbon, the small gold sticker of the shop. Her hands did not tremble. She was proud of that. "You have wonderful taste," Isabel said, taking the parcel. It was a generous thing to say, and she clearly meant it. "Merci, madame," Margot said. "I hope the evening is everything you want it to be." She said it and meant it more or less. The part of her that did not mean it, she kept somewhere quiet, where it would not show. The bell rang twice, once for each of them, and then they were gone, and the shop settled back into its afternoon stillness, and Margot stood behind the counter for a long moment, with her hands flat on the glass, and the particular loneliness of someone who has just been reminded, gently and without malice, of exactly where she stands. She straightened the bottles they had disturbed. She went back to work. He came in the following morning before she had finished opening the shutters. Margot heard the bell and turned, and there he was, slightly out of breath in a way that suggested he had walked faster than he intended, holding his hat in his hands with the particular awkwardness of a man who has rehearsed something and is no longer sure it was a good idea. "The shop isn't open yet," she said, not unkindly. "I know. I'm sorry." He glanced at the hat in his hands as though surprised to find it there. I thought I should." He stopped and started again. "The other day, at the port, I said something I shouldn't have and I wanted to apologize." Margot looked at him for a moment. The morning light came through the half-open shutters in long pale strips across the floor. "Monsieur Whitmore," she said, "you said nothing that requires an apology." "I said more than I intended. That is a different thing entirely." He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, not quite relief, but close to it. He nodded slowly, turning the hat once in his hands, and the silence that followed was easier than the ones before, which Margot noticed and chose not to remark upon. She finished opening the shutters and went behind the counter, and he drifted naturally into the shop the way he always did, without particular purpose, as though the shelves were simply an excuse for the standing still. He seemed, she thought, lighter than before. There was something in his posture, a loosening, a faint but unmistakable ease, that had not been there on his previous visits. She noticed it the way she noticed everything about him, quietly and against her better judgment. She busied herself with the morning arrangements. He said nothing for a while. It was this, the lightness, the ease, something almost like relief radiating off him in a way she couldn't quite name, that made her do it. She would wonder later what had possessed her. She was not usually reckless. She was not usually anything other than composed. "You seem well this morning," she said, without looking up from the bottles she was arranging. "Better than yesterday. Did you have a pleasant evening?" A pause. "I did go out, yes," he said carefully. She kept her eyes on the shelf. Her voice was perfectly neutral, perfectly professional, the voice she used with everyone. "A dinner, perhaps? I understand there were some interesting gatherings last night in Monte Carlo." Another pause, longer this time. She turned, because something in the quality of his silence demanded it, and found him looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something had crossed his face, sharp, almost cold, and for one uncomfortable moment, she thought she had gone too far, had revealed something she shouldn't have, had made a fool of herself entirely. Then it passed. His jaw loosened, his eyes changed. The coldness dissolved into something that looked, remarkably, like embarrassment. "How did you—" he began, then stopped. He set his hat on the counter and looked at it. "It was not my idea," he said. "The dinner. A friend arranged it. I went because—" He paused again, turning the hat slowly. "I went because it was easier than explaining why I didn't want to go." Margot said nothing. She had learned again to give silence its space. "I left early," he added quietly, almost to himself. Then he looked up. "I don't know why I'm telling you this." "You don't have to," she said. "No," he agreed. "I know." He picked up his hat from the counter. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read, something between apology and something else, something she did not dare name. And then he nodded, once, and moved toward the door. "Margot," he said, at the threshold. It was the first time he had used only her name, without the formality of Mademoiselle, and it landed differently than she expected. "Monsieur Whitmore," she answered. He almost smiled. "Arthur," he said. And then he left, and the bell rang, and Margot stood very still in the new morning light, and did not move for quite some time. Sunday came with the particular softness that Monaco reserved for days without obligation, the streets quieter, the light slower, the sea a deeper shade of blue than on working days, as though it too had decided to rest. Margot walked without direction, which was rare for her. She was a practical girl, a girl with purposes and schedules and things to be done. But the shop was closed, and her apartment had felt too small that morning. And so she had put on her good coat and walked out into the afternoon with nothing more than the vague intention of letting the city settle something in her that she couldn't quite name. She saw them from across the street. A café terrace, the one on the corner with the yellow awning that she had always liked. Small tables, white chairs, the Sunday crowd thin and unhurried. Isabel was unmistakable. The posture, the dark hair, a cream-colored dress that even from a distance announced its own expense. She was laughing at something, her head tilted back, one hand resting easily on the table. And across from her, Arthur. Margot stopped walking. She stood on the pavement and looked at them the way you look at something you were not prepared to see, without defenses, without the usual arrangements the heart makes in advance. He was leaning slightly forward, listening in the attentive way she knew, the way that made whoever he was listening to feel like the only person in the room. He was not smiling, but he was present, and Isabel was beautiful, and the afternoon light fell across the table between them like a benediction. Margot turned and walked away. She walked quickly, more quickly than the occasion required. Her good coat suddenly too warm, the street suddenly too bright. She told herself she was being foolish. She was a girl who sold perfume. He was a man who had told her his name once, at a doorway, on his way out. She had no claim on anything. She had imagined the whole thing, or if she had not imagined it, she had assembled it wrongly, had placed herself in a story where she did not belong. She was almost at the corner when the tears came, quiet and unwelcome, the kind that arrive before you have given them permission. She did not stop walking. He saw her from across the street. He almost didn't. He had been half listening to Isabel, who was in the middle of a sentence he already knew the destination of, a sentence that had been building since the moment the mutual friend had arranged this lunch with the particular enthusiasm of someone who considers themselves a gifted matchmaker. Isabel was doing it beautifully, he had to admit. She was too intelligent to be obvious about it. But he knew, and she knew he knew. And the whole afternoon had the careful, exhausting quality of two people pretending a conversation is about one thing when it is clearly about another. And then something at the edge of his vision made him look up, and he saw Margot on the opposite pavement, in a dark coat, walking with her head slightly down. He saw her stop. He saw her look at their table, at Isabel, at him, and he saw, even from that distance, the precise moment something crossed her face. And then she turned and walked away, faster than before, and he saw in the set of her shoulders something that reached across the street and took hold of him with a force that surprised him entirely. He was on his feet before he had made a conscious decision to stand. "Arthur," Isabel said. Something in her voice told him she had seen it too. "Forgive me." He reached into his pocket without counting the money. "I'm sorry, Isabel. There's someone. I have to go." A pause. When he looked at her, he found an expression he hadn't expected. Not anger, not confusion, but something quieter than both. She looked at him for a moment, then at the empty pavement across the street, then back at him. "Go," she said simply. He crossed the street without looking back. He found her at the corner of a narrow street that climbed away from the port, walking fast with her head down. He said her name once, Margot, and she stopped, but did not turn around. He came to stand behind her. "It isn't what you think," he said. A long moment. A cat crossed the end of the street and disappeared into shadow. "I'm not thinking anything," she said. Her voice was steady, which cost her something. "You are," he said gently, "and I understand why. But you're wrong." She turned then, and he saw her face. The brightness in her eyes she was working to contain, the composure she was reassembling in real time. And something in his chest did something he had no name for. "Isabel is someone I have known for a long time," he said carefully. "A friend of the family. Someone arranged lunch thinking they were being helpful." He paused. "It was not my idea, and it was not what it looked like. It was enough of the truth. Not all of it. There were parts of it he was not ready to say. Not here, not yet. Not standing in a narrow Sunday street with her eyes doing what they were doing to his ability to think clearly. But it was enough. "You don't owe me explanations," she said. "No," he agreed. "I know I don't." He said it quietly, and what he left in the space around it was something neither of them pretended not to understand. They stood in the narrow street with the Sunday afternoon wrapped around them, the distant sound of the port below, a radio playing somewhere above from an open window, something slow and French and entirely without mercy. She looked at him for a long moment. At this man who had walked into her shop with a fortune and a family drama, and a coat that embarrassed him. Who had followed her to the port and said more than he intended, and then retreated. Who had just left a cafe terrace without looking back, over something he could not entirely explain and had not tried to. He lifted his hand and touched her face, just briefly, just the back of his fingers against her cheek, and looked at her with an expression that asked something without words. She answered it. He kissed her there, in the narrow street, with the Sunday light falling between the buildings and the radio playing above them. And it was not a long kiss, but it was a serious one, the kind that closes a door behind it. When they separated, she looked at him, and he looked at her. And neither of them spoke because there was nothing that needed saying, and they had both learned by now the value of silence between them. "Walk with me," he said finally. She did. "But tell me, do you believe that two people from worlds so different can truly find each other? Or does love, no matter how real, always surrender to the life we were born into? Let me know in the comments." What followed was the best kind of ordinary. He came every morning, sometimes before the shop opened, and Margot would find him waiting outside with 2 coffees from the place on the corner, leaning against the wall, with the patient ease of a man who has somewhere to be, and has chosen, deliberately, to be here instead. She never told him he didn't have to. He never pretended he was passing by. They fell into the rhythms that people fall into when they are happy and not yet afraid of being happy. He learned which fragrances she loved and which ones she found overrated, and he had opinions about both that made her laugh. She learned that he read in the evenings and walked in the mornings and thought too much in between, and that when something troubled him, he went quiet in a particular way that she had learned to recognize and not to rush. On Tuesdays, the shop was slow, and he would sit on the small chair near the window, the one meant for waiting husbands, and they would talk for hours about things that had nothing to do with coal or perfume, or the distance between their worlds. He told her about the north of England, about the way the light fell over the moors in winter, gray and vast and strangely beautiful. She told him about her grandmother's village in Provence, about lavender fields and bread baked before dawn, and a life so far from Monaco it felt like something she had read in a book. One afternoon he brought her a small branch of mimosa from the market and set it on the counter without ceremony, without explanation, and went to stand at the shelves as though nothing had happened. She put it in a glass of water and said nothing either, and they were both, she thought, perfectly happy. She did not let herself think about England, about Isabel, about the things he had not yet finished telling her. She was 22 years old, and it was spring in Monaco, and he looked at her the way she had always hoped someone might, and she decided, quietly and without announcing it to anyone, to let herself have this. For 3 weeks, she let herself have this. And then one Tuesday, he didn't come. She told herself it was nothing. Men had appointments. Men had letters to write, and hotels to deal with, and lives that existed outside of her shop and her mornings. She arranged the window display twice, and served 4 customers, and did not check the door more than was reasonable. He did not come on Wednesday either. By Thursday she knew, in the way the body knows things before the mind will admit them, that something had changed. She went to the hotel on Friday. She told herself she was passing, which was not true. The hotel was in the opposite direction, and asked at the desk with what she hoped was a casual air whether Monsieur Whitmore was available. The young man at the desk checked his register. Monsieur Whitmore checked out on Tuesday morning, mademoiselle, he said, not unkindly. He left a letter for a Mademoiselle Margot, but... He paused, looking faintly uncomfortable. It appears the letter is no longer here. I'm very sorry. I don't know what happened to it. Margot thanked him. She walked back to the shop. She served the rest of the day's customers with her professional smile, the warm and neutral one, the one that gave nothing away. She was very good at her job. Isabel came in on a Saturday. She was dressed simply, elegantly, in a pale blue that suited the morning. She looked around the shop with a smile that was genuinely pleasant, and Margot's first thought, shameful in retrospect, was that she was simply a customer. Bonjour, Margot said. Bonjour. Isabel moved to the shelves with the unhurried familiarity of a woman accustomed to beautiful things. She picked up a bottle, considered it, set it down. Then she turned and looked at Margot directly, and the smile remained, but something behind it had changed. I won't waste your time, she said pleasantly. Or mine. Margot said nothing. You are a lovely girl, Isabel continued, in the tone of someone paying a debt they find distasteful. I mean that, and I understand, truly I do, how these things happen. A man like Arthur, alone in a foreign city, a pretty shop girl with kind eyes. She paused, tilting her head slightly. It was probably very sweet. The word landed where it was meant to. What I want you to understand, Isabel said, moving toward the counter now, her voice dropping just slightly, becoming something quieter and therefore more dangerous, is that this cannot continue. Arthur has a family, obligations. A life that was arranged long before he arrived in Monaco and will continue long after he leaves. His father is already aware of the situation. There are people, serious people, with serious influence, who will ensure that what needs to happen, happens. She placed both hands on the glass counter, very lightly, and looked at Margot with an expression that was almost compassionate. "I am not your enemy," she said. "I am simply being honest with you, which is more than most people in my position would bother to do. Go back to your life, mademoiselle. It is a perfectly good life. There is no shame in it." She straightened, smoothed her jacket, picked up her gloves from the counter. "The letter he left for you," she added, almost as an afterthought, her eyes moving briefly away. "I'm afraid it never arrived. These things happen." She smiled once more, warm, final, devastating, and walked to the door. The bell rang, and Margot stood alone in the shop, in the silence, with her hands flat on the glass counter exactly as she had stood before, and felt the particular humiliation of someone who has been shown, gently and thoroughly, the precise dimensions of their own smallness. She had known, hadn't she? Some part of her had always known. She was a girl who sold perfume. She had looked at a man from another world and let herself believe, for 3 weeks, that the world had no say in the matter. She straightened the bottles Isabel had disturbed. She went back to work. She did not cry until she was home. 3 weeks passed the way difficult weeks do. Slowly at first, then all at once, in a blur of small routines that Margot performed with the careful dedication of someone who has decided that structure is the only reliable thing left. She opened the shop at 8. She arranged the displays. She smiled at customers with the warm, neutral smile. She wrapped parcels with tissue and ribbon and the small gold sticker. And she went home in the evenings and cooked something simple and read until the words stopped making sense. And then she slept and began again. She did not go back to the port on her lunch hours. She told herself, in the reasonable voice she used for reasonable things, that Isabel had been right. Not cruel. Right. The world was the world, and it did not reorganize itself for the convenience of feelings that had no business existing in the first place. Arthur Whitmore had a life in England, a family, obligations older than she was. She had 3 years in a perfume shop and a small apartment up the hill, and a perfectly good life, as Isabel had said, and there was no shame in it. She said this to herself often enough that there were hours, not many, but some, when she almost believed it. The mimosa he had brought her had dried on the counter. She had not thrown it away. She told herself she simply hadn't got around to it. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, tucked between the Morning Post and a delivery notice. Her name was written on the envelope in handwriting she did not recognize but knew immediately, the way you know certain things without being able to explain how. She set it on the counter. She served 2 customers before she opened it. "Margot, I don't know how much you know, or what you have been told, or whether this letter will reach you at all. I am sending it through someone I trust, which is a short list at the moment. I left Monaco because I had no choice. My father, I won't explain everything here, not in a letter, not like this. Only that I was given very little time and no good options, and I took the one that caused the least damage to the people I could not afford to damage. I know how that sounds. I know what it looks like from where you are standing. I am asking you to believe, without proof and without promise of anything immediate, that what happened between us was not something I have set aside. I am not capable of setting it aside. It will take time. There are things I need to resolve, with my father, with my own life, with a future that was planned by other people before I had any say in it. I am working on all of it. Slowly, imperfectly, in the way that real things get done. I will come back for you. I know that is easy to write and hard to believe. I am writing it anyway, because it is true, and because you deserve at least that much honesty from me. Wait for me, if you can. If you cannot, I understand that too. Arthur. Margot read it once. Then she folded it carefully, with the same precision she gave everything, and placed it in the pocket of her apron, close to her, where she could feel the edge of it against her hand for the rest of the day. She did not read it again until she was home. Then she read it many times. Hope, she discovered, is a complicated thing to carry. It is lighter than grief, but heavier than certainty, and it sits in the chest at an awkward angle, neither comfortable nor entirely unbearable. She went back to her routines with it tucked inside her, this small, unreasonable thing, and she did not speak of it to anyone because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like foolishness. The weeks became months. Summer arrived in Monaco with its usual extravagance, the port full, the streets loud with languages, the casino glittering late into the warm nights. Margot sold more perfume than any other season. She was good at her job. She had always been good at her job. She thought about him less than she had in the beginning. She was proud of that, and then felt guilty for being proud of it, and then decided that guilt was an indulgence she couldn't afford, and moved on. The dried mimosa she finally threw away in July. It took her longer than it should have. Autumn came and went quietly. The tourists thinned. The streets returned to themselves. Monaco in November had a melancholy that Margot had always found beautiful in a way she couldn't explain. The light lower, the colors softer, the city breathing out after the long performance of summer. She stopped waiting, somewhere in November. Not dramatically. There was no moment of decision, no deliberate closing of a door. The hope simply became something quieter, something she kept not because she believed it, but because she had grown used to its weight, and to put it down felt like a loss she wasn't ready for. She kept his letter in the drawer beside her bed. She was perfectly fine. She set the letter in the drawer beside her bed and made a decision, quiet and private, to stop organizing her life around an absence. It was not a dramatic decision. It did not happen in a single moment. It happened the way most real things happen, gradually, on an ordinary morning, when she woke up and realized she had slept the whole night without thinking of him once, and felt something that was closer to peace than sadness. She went back to her life. Her real life, the one that had been there all along, patient and solid and entirely hers. She had friends she had been neglecting. She had books she had been meaning to read. She had a shop she was good at running and a city she genuinely loved, and a future that did not require anyone's permission to exist. There were men, occasionally. A young architect who came in twice to buy gifts, and on the third time asked if she might like to have dinner. A journalist from Paris who spent a month in Monaco and made her laugh more than she expected. She was kind to both of them, and honest. And when nothing came of either, she felt only a mild and manageable regret. She was not ready. She knew she was not ready. But she was living, which was something, and she was content, which was more than she had expected. Spring came again. The mimosa bloomed in the hills above the city, and the port filled slowly, and Monaco put its best face on for another season, as it always did, as it always would. Margot opened the shop at 8. She arranged the displays. She smiled at customers with the warm, neutral smile. She was perfectly fine. She was rearranging the back shelf on a Tuesday morning in April, reaching for a bottle on the high shelf, half her attention on the inventory she was composing in her head, when she heard the bell above the door. She didn't turn immediately. She had learned over the course of a year to stop turning immediately. And then she heard her name. Just that. Just Margot. And that, my friends, is where I leave Margot and Arthur. Thank you for being here with me today. Truly. Every time you watch, every time you leave a comment, every time you share these stories with someone you think might love them, you make this little corner of nostalgia worth building. If you haven't subscribed yet, consider doing it now. There are many more stories waiting. More streets, more secrets, more Monaco. I'll see you in the next one.